Very good to have you join us this evening for tonight's thinking. I hope you have had, I hope everything has been explained to you, but just to very quickly again, thinking is the heart of our editorial process here at Tortoise. It's how we find out what people think. It helps inform our point of view, and it's one of the things that makes the way we do journalism at Tortoise different, I think, from anywhere else I've ever worked. So it's great to have you here. We rely on you to join in through the chat, or as would have been explained, to raise your hand by pressing on the participants tab and looking for the raise hand button, and we will try to bring as many people, as many of you into this conversation as we can this evening. If you hear a noise, there's some very, very aggressive hoovering that has just started outside the little room where I'm sitting, but I'm trusting that it may not last too long. I just wanted to make a couple of quick points before we tuck in, and I think the first is a plea not to forget what we were all doing 290 days ago, because that seems to be an important moment. And to save you all counting backwards on your fingers, obviously you will have guessed that that was the morning of December the 13th, the day after the 2019 general election, when we woke up to Prime Minister Boris Johnson with a majority of 80 seats. And all those Conservative MPs who had backed him as leader, sometimes in spite of their doubts, because they thought he was a winner, would have felt completely vindicated that morning. I mentioned that simply to say that, although of course I'm pleased that we're having this conversation now, I think it's worth remembering how, in a sense, how extraordinary it is that we are having this conversation now after such a relatively short amount of time and with such a big majority, because 80 is quite a big majority. You have to go back, Tim will probably correct me on this, but Tim Bale, when we turn to him, you have to go back arguably to Anthony Eden to find a prime minister who was forced to resign, having come in with a majority of that size. And the second thing, just briefly to mention before we get going, is the truism, or maybe it's turning now into a cliche, which is that the pandemic reveals more than it changes. And I'm really interested in that question in relation to Boris Johnson. Has it revealed something about Boris Johnson, or has it changed Boris Johnson? I think that's something that we're going to want to talk about this evening as well. Because if it's revealed something, then maybe Prime Minister is in difficulty. Maybe getting the job was more important than doing it. Maybe he doesn't really have what it takes to do this job, especially in difficult times. But if it's changed him, then the question may be, for how long? We did an article last week about long COVID, and it's still wreathed in uncertainty. Is this a prime minister who might recover? He might get his mojo back in a month or two, and would that recover his position on the backbenches? So before we get tucked into all this, let me introduce. We've got some great people to help us think our way through it. We've got Katie Perrier, who runs a company now called In-House Communications. Before that, Katie was notably Director of Communications in 10 Downing Street under Theresa May. And way back when, she was part of the team that helped Boris Johnson become London Mayor in 2008, was it, Katie? I think?
Correct.
We've got Tim Bale, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary's University of London, and for my money, one of the best political pundits we have in this country. So it's a great thing to have you with us this evening, Tim. And I think, although I can't see him on screen yet, I think David Lidington has joined us as well. And David was, as many of you will know, effectively Deputy Prime Minister under Theresa May. So a great deal of help. David, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much indeed, Ceri. Good to see you.
Katie, can I start with you? I would let a simple question. What's gone wrong for Boris Johnson?
Oh, what's gone right for Boris Johnson recently? And you've got to, I have a lot of sympathy for him, really. I think that any Prime Minister in that position would have struggled right now. It doesn't matter what your front bench looks like, doesn't matter what your support team would be like around you. These are the unknowns, the great unknowns, and it's the gift that keeps on giving, coronavirus. Just when you think you might be on top of it, you've got a second wave. Just when you think you may have a furlough scheme that you've sorted out so that you can keep millions of people in employment, comes, you have to come up with something next because it's not quite enough. And so what's gone wrong really is that from the minute that he took office, he thought that he'd be able to move quickly. The minute he started going, if you remember in January, there was something called the Boris Bouts. Businesses were really feeling it. Investment was being released. People were talking about infrastructure kind of projects, and I certainly felt it from running a private business, that, you know, it was really motoring, and then we hit COVID, and partnered with the fact that his advice that he gives, and you just saw a slide just a minute ago about the amount of U-turns that have been going on. He gives some advice, and the advice then has to be updated and changed. Well, whose fault is that? Is that Boris for giving poor advice, or is the fact that things keep on changing all the time, and it's very hard to look competent in this environment? Very difficult to do so. And I do think that yes, they've done some things wrong, and they will look back and you know, think about the mistakes they've made. One of the things I once said to Boris when he went for second term as London Mayor was that, you know what, you're going to have to stand on a legacy. You know that, don't you? So you better build the houses that you promised. You better do the things that you said, because you're going again, and it's not that easy. The election literature isn't that easy to write a second time around. And I think in the back of his mind, he will know and remember that you can't waste a week, you know, or a month in this job, because eventually you wake up and realise you've got nothing to put on the election leaflet, or you've got his bad news stories. And so I think that it'll be in the back of his mind as to when can we do a reset? How quickly can we get back on the front foot? And how can we regain this? Because it's sliding in the wrong direction at the moment.
And Katie, my colleague Tessa was pointing out in the chat that some people are managing to look competent. Jacinda Ardern is managing to look competent. So where has he gone wrong on, as you say, it's a very tricky environment to look competent in, but what would you say, where would you say that Boris himself could have done better? Well,
of course, one of the issues, things you just pointed out there, is that there's a woman in charge. There's not enough women around the top table, I may add, both inside number 10 and in the cabinet table. And I do think that things like U-turns on, you know, I just written 3 things down really quickly from that slide earlier that caught my eye. Marcus Rashford, the free lunches, and schools, exams, things like that. You know, I'm sure there is a time at number 10 when I was there, certainly, that things we would have you know, read the mood earlier. And I think there is a female thing about that they're slightly missing. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think that they're missing that somewhat. I do feel also that Boris, you talked about, has he changed? And I know you want to come on to that in a bit, but there's a libertarian inside Boris that's screaming to get out, that cannot bear to keep people locked away. He's, you know, if you think about his role as the Mayor of London, this is a great melting pot of the world. You can make it here. You can go and do great things. He hates the thought that he may be stopping people trading, people seeing their loved ones. He may be, you know, be the reason why businesses might be going bust right now. He absolutely hates it. So there's a push and pull in the centre all the time, which means that sometimes the advice, such as closing pubs at 10 o'clock at night without thinking they might all chuck out at the same time, and you might have lots of singing drunk people on the street at once, doesn't really go through the right lens. It doesn't really, I'm not sure they play it out enough, because there's this push and pull all the time. Whereas if you see Nicola Sturgeon, who some people would argue has had a good crisis, she's kind of confident in her position on these things. Yes, I don't want to do it, but I'm going to do it because it's for your own good. Where Boris is always kind of, you know, there's this kind of pull back to, I don't want to do this to people. And so I think that that's possibly where some things have gone wrong in the past.
Okay, David Lineage, let me come to you, because you'd be pleased if you could see the chat. There's a small Bring Back Theresa May campaign just beginning to form in there somewhere. We may not quite get there this evening, but you know, Katie has given us this picture that there's a degree of sympathy, both personally for the Prime Minister's illness and politically for the difficulty of the situation. But if I put to you the question I put to Katie to start with, what do you think has gone wrong so far for the Prime Minister?
I agree with a lot of Katie's analysis. I think that I think the government needs to raise its game is ironically on the thing that probably some of the people around the Prime Minister would have said was their strength, which is in communications. And I think I would be saying that you need to have greater clarity over your strategic objective. We know at the start it was that phrase, squash the sombrero. It was to keep case numbers sufficiently low so that the NHS was not overwhelmed. Is it still that now? Or is it keep the cases low until a vaccine comes along? What is sufficiently low? And then I think you need to have greater clarity about what the rules are at any moment. Now, frankly, my own preference would be that to move towards something where you've got some very clear, fairly simple guidance about distancing and face masks and so on, and then you probably have rules that you make available an easy to access website or app or whatever as to what may apply for a period in a particular area if you have to bring things in. My feel at the moment, and talking to people, is that so many people have given up on understanding what it is exactly that the rules are saying at the moment, and therefore they are, particularly young people, not just young people, making their own judgments, making their own assessments of risk. And I think part of that is to be government can afford to be more open about the fact they are still wrestling with a pandemic where even the top scientists in the world are still uncertain about a great many things. They know a lot more than they did back in February, March, but there's still a lot they don't know. Long COVID is an example of that. The public get that, and the public get the fact the government's trying to balance different competing risks. You know, you have to have people in work to support their families and pay the tax to keep the NHS funded next year. You've got to balance your wish to get COVID cases down against the fact that there are now many, many people whose cancers and other conditions are not being diagnosed and not being treated anything like as quickly as they ought to be. And we will see more serious illness and deaths as a consequence of that happening. How do you balance those? And I think the government's been too inclined to hug things to itself, not take the public into its confidence, not explain things with sufficient clarity. And I think they could do more of that. And I think there is still a public wish amongst people, many of whom weren't great supporters of Boris Johnson or even the Conservative Party, who actually in a crisis want their government, whoever it is, to succeed, actually to come up with the answers. And I think the government could tap again into that reservoir of goodwill if they sort out the things that are not working well at the moment.
Yeah, and how much? I won't ask you to sort of psychoanalyze Boris Johnson, because heaven help us, we've got enough already. But I do wonder how much of this tension between the sort of libertarian, you can see, the great sort of balancing act that the country has to sustain is between the sort of damage to the economy and threat to public health. And Boris Johnson, to an extent, went into COVID, I think, clearly in the side of the sort of the economy first camp. He made that extraordinary speech in Greenwich where he's talking about Britain, sort of taking the lead in that sort of, against this slightly hysterical overreaction to the pandemic. And he does seem to have moved as a result of scientific advice and his own personal illness. Do you think that has deprived him of a kind of natural constituency within the Tory party, so that he's almost sort of rootless within the party now because of that shift?
I think that's to exaggerate it, but I think that what is true, I think, is that he's clearly shifted his own position on handling COVID as a result of the scientific advice he's had, and inevitably as a result of the personal ordeal that he himself went through. And frankly, if any of us had had a brush with death in that way, I think we would have been bound to be affected by that. But I think it's an exaggeration to say that, he's now floating rootlessly within the party. Yes, there are some of those people on the more libertarian right of the Conservative Party who supported him over Europe and who also rather like the approach he took in London, although they're not necessarily on the right of the party, the people who liked his style as mayor. But the libertarian right, the Steve Bakers and so on. They are trying to push him to adopt a more Swedish style approach to use the sort of the generalization. But I think the idea that this is a signal of some wish to have a new leader or to topple Boris Johnson, I think that is wildly exaggerated. The other point I just made, you know, if you're talking about the Prime Minister personally on this, don't ever forget that even if we've not had COVID, being a head of government is a back-breaking job. You know, I work closely for Theresa. I was close enough to David Cameron to see some of the things that he was having to shoulder. You know, Boris Johnson has got COVID to battle with and the economic backwash of COVID. He's also, you know, handling the Brexit negotiations. He's also got all the big decisions about the economy, about tax, about public services, about climate change to take forward. He's the only one, at the end of the day, who takes the difficult decisions. And there's a defence review, and there's a hell of a lot going on that you and I don't see. Every day, the Prime Minister is getting intelligence reports from the different agencies. The Prime Minister may be having to respond to intelligence about a potential terrorist attack, decide what to do, how much to say, and so on. We don't rightly get to see any of that, but those pressures are there constantly, and those haven't gone away because Boris Johnson is also having to deal with COVID.
Yeah. Okay. Tim Bale, let me come to you. Thanks for being patient. Let me actually, I'm just going to ask you the same question I've asked David and Katie. What's your assessment of how things have gone wrong and wrong quite quickly for Boris Johnson?
Well, I guess my assessment would be that I'm not sure that Boris Johnson was ever really fit for purpose, to be honest. I think Conservative MPs understandably turned to him as the kind of, you know, break glass in case of emergency candidate in the summer of 2019. He's obviously a great campaigner. No one who could win the mayoralty twice in London is anything but a great campaigner. But I'm just not sure that he has the skill set naturally, or indeed the people around him, to be able to do what, as David said, is an incredibly demanding job. It is simply the case that some people, when they are asked to step up to that role, find that they have been over-promoted, even when they have made an incredible success of previous roles. Gordon Brown will be one example. Some people would also cite Theresa May, and to cite the example that you gave, Anthony Eden as Foreign Secretary back in the 1950s. It's an incredibly difficult job. It requires someone who, you know, has an incredible command of detail and yet is also able to handle all sorts of stimuli coming in at the same time. It is a job for someone in some senses serious, particularly in these very serious times. And I think, to be honest, the Conservative Party is probably just, you know, reaping what it sowed. It didn't necessarily pick Boris Johnson to be a great Prime Minister. It picked Boris Johnson because they thought he could get them out of a hole and win the 2019 election. It doesn't surprise me, and I don't think it will surprise that many people, that he's not making that great a fist of being Prime Minister, especially on top of all the things that Katie and David were saying about COVID in particular.
So in that sense, Tim, you are firmly on the, to go back to my sort of premise, does the pandemic reveal or does it change? Your view is that it's revealed.
Well, it doesn't so much reveal, really, because I think it was pretty obvious in the first place. I mean, it's no great surprise, I think, to a lot of people who followed Boris Johnson's career over the last couple of decades, that, you know, he is out of his depth and just not the man for this job. I mean, I don't want to kick a man when he's down, clearly, and obviously I have sympathy for him on a human level when it comes to COVID, but I don't think either the situation in itself or the illness that he himself suffered accounts for, you know, how poorly things are going. And you can also, of course, point to some of the people around him perhaps not being of the caliber that you would like to see either in an advisory capacity or indeed in cabinet.
Okay, Katie, I'm going to come to you in a second just to see whether there's an alternative view of Boris Johnson's capacity out there. But before I do that, two things. Firstly, please do raise your hand, raise your blue electronic hand if you'd like to be brought into the conversation. We would love to have you here. And secondly, a number of people have been saying in the chat that they liked the slides that we showed at the beginning. So let me just see if my colleague Zav Greenwood can just reprise those for us, because they flicked by fairly quickly at the top there. Zav, are you out there somewhere in the ether?
Yeah, I'm here. Tom should be putting the slides on your screen now.
There they are.
If you can't hear me, just type something in the chat. My internet's been a bit dodgy. So I mean, much of this has already been covered by Tim and others, but just starting on the U-turns, I think the point which David Lidington made about communications, and the point that was made about the government not really being kind of in tune with the public is kind of demonstrated in some of these. So the free school meals U-turn, which came from Marcus Rashford's campaign, the exam grades U-turn, which schools have been warning about for months and months, and so have universities. The return to work U-turn, which everyone kind of expected would go wrong. It's hard, being a government in the first place, never mind during the pandemic, but it's definitely clear that the government just seems kind of behind on all these kind of U-turns, which they've eventually had to kind of put in place. And then if we go to the next slide, so this next slide is kind of trying to start to cautiously approach kind of rumours in the press that Boris Johnson is still ill. The rumours kind of began at the end of August when Dominic Cummings' father-in-law reportedly told a Times diary reader that Boris Johnson was still ill, and the second quote kind of sums up what we're seeing again and again in all these reports about what's going on inside it. Number 10, there are these kind of lines thrown in that people don't think Boris is quite right. And the third quote I've put in, not because Toby Young is any kind of medical professional, but because I think it really marks the shift in some people's opinions. This is a Boris supporter who 5 months ago was saying Britain needs Boris, the extraordinary man I've known for 35 years. In this article, he says, I admit it, I was wrong to back Boris. And there is something to be said of, Toby Young is kind of hypothesizing that Boris is still suffering the effects of the illness. What is it actually saying? It's saying that Toby Young thinks that Boris Johnson has changed, and it remains to be seen how many supporters kind of feel the same. And then we're just going to go to some approval ratings next. So Starmer became leader on the 4th of April, and Johnson was taken into hospital the next day. The moment Johnson kind of was taken into hospital, the approval ratings started to go down a lot. They stabilized a bit, and then they went down even more. And you can really see there's been a huge, huge shift. He got a kind of boost at the start of the pandemic as you kind of have this rally around the flag kind of notion. But then quickly, once he kind of left hospital, it plummeted, and it hasn't really recovered since then. And then if we go to the next one, this is a kind of continuation of that. So on the 28th of March, which was just before the Labour leadership election came to a close, the Conservatives were 26 points ahead, and they had more than 50% of the voting public on their side. So really, there has been a dramatic shift over the past few months. I think we can't really express enough just what a shift this is. Starmer had a lot of ground which he was able to catch up on, but still, by kind of biding his time and letting the Conservatives make the mistakes that they've made to some extent, there's been this dramatic shift. And just a couple of days ago, Labour took the lead for the first time since, I think, the middle of 2019. So it's a big kind of polling lead which has been lost. And then the final slide, I think I wanted just to put this in just to give a sense that beyond COVID, there are other issues which are coming up. I mean, these are stats which may not really affect Boris's own tenure. The no deal Brexit forecasts are forecasts for 15 years time. But I just wanted to give an impression that no deal Brexit is coming kind of down the track at us. It's on the 31st of December. And I think, if anything, more than these GDP figures, I think the queues of lorries in Kent, with or without a deal, which will appear, will be a kind of visible mark of the success or lack of success of Brexit in the immediacy. And so if we have that coming down the line at the end of December and we are still in the middle of COVID, it's still looking not quite so rosy for Boris. And that's everything.
Okay, so thanks for that. I think that's, you helped explain why the mood about a deal, a skinny deal, seems to be brightening somewhat, I think. But Katie, before we went to Zav and looked at those slides, we had a very tough assessment from Tim Bale about Boris's capabilities. From your perspective, could there have been a decent Prime Minister in him, given what you saw at City Hall?
Yes, because I've never, ever seen any crowd react to a politician in 20 years I've worked in politics like the way they react to him. And of course, that's hard to maintain. But I saw it in London in 2008, and I saw it again out on the leadership campaign and also the general election. The thing is that the problem that Boris has in a virtual world, as we would normally be in a room right now, would be, there would be personalities coming out, we'd all be having a nice time, and there'd be people that shine and say brilliant things. We're trying to do this on Zoom, and it's working very well, but Boris, can't really perform virtually because he needs his audience. He needs his audience out on the road, and he needs his audience behind him in the chamber. And he's the perfect politician to have. The first time I ever went in the chamber with Theresa May, I couldn't believe how loud it was sitting in there. It was literally like a zoo of, really, really, really loud animals all going off at once. And you're trying to get your voice across, and you're trying to get your point across. Boris loves that environment. This is the environment of me at school. This is I can rise above all this, and I can be louder, and I can be optimistic, and I can take this audience with me. And he's standing there on his own now, and he looks on his own. And I think that that's a really, really powerful thing that we see week after week after week, that this environment doesn't really suit his style of politics. He's not a loner in that regard. He's a loner in terms of he doesn't have lots and lots of Westminster chums to rely on, but he loves the audience. He wants to be part of that team. And so I think he needs to try and find a way that, he wants to press that reset button, but every time he tries to do it, he's hit with either another wave or a huge bill that comes in, or ONS stats that rock up, or just one bad story after another. And so he needs to find a way to break through that and say, right, my job was to do X, Y, and Z. This is what I said when I was going to come into office. I have to get back on that. We have to go and do these things. The levelling up agenda through the Towns Fund is crucial to Boris cutting through and trying to deliver on some of the things he promised, those red wall seats and elsewhere in the country. So I think that he can find a way out of this, but it's not going to be easy at all. And as David quite rightly pointed out earlier, he has to have a clear strategy, and everybody needs to know what they're following. And at the moment, they're chasing their tails a bit inside government. I got a letter today from a minister. I won't say which one because I do still want some friends left in politics. But I got a letter from a minister today that said, I do refer you to my colleague Jake Berry, who is in charge of the Northern Powerhouse and etc. X, Y, and Z. And I thought, he moved from that job about 6 months ago, didn't he? And I did a quick Google check. And a letter that I got from the government today was telling me about someone that had left that job. And it just shows they don't know, they're rushing, they're doing 100 things at once. I used to say in government that, what did David Cameron do all day before Brexit? Look at the diary, it's just banged out with all this Brexit stuff. Can you imagine what it's like now? It just must be hellish.
Yeah, okay. Let me just try and bring in a couple of people who put their hands up to join with us. Nacho Moraes, are you out there? Let me
yes,
see.
yeah. Thank you very much.
Nacho, thanks for joining us. I haven't seen what you've been saying in the chat. So are you sympathetic to Boris Johnson or not so much?
I think probably we are not witnessing the best version that we could of Boris Johnson. The thing is that the mayoral liberal, open-minded Boris Johnson, because obviously all the Brexit debate, etc., has made him switch to the right on the things that, and often you are not sure if we are who we are hearing talking, if it's him or if it's Dominic Cummings. It's a bit of a Milli Vanilli situation. In that point, I think that COVID has dislocated his strategy. The thing is that the strategy could be, okay, make all the tough decisions now, going through this creative distraction that probably was in the minds of Cummings, and they will fructify before maybe 2022, that is when late 2022 people start making their minds. So the thing is that now it's out of the way. So things that even if we get a vaccine very soon and COVID goes out of the way, the margin for taking those measures contracts. So things that the parties, even in general, in a difficult situation, the thing is that in 2024 they will have been 14 years in government. And the thing is that at that point, the erosion is almost inevitable, even when Boris has tried to make a reset, like he has tried to make this as, okay, we are restarting anew and with my premiership. So the thing is that you see, okay, if he throws a towel, okay, how that succession goes through? Because after the purge of 2019, the thing is that a lot of talent left the parliamentary group. So the thing is that you are left with basically the tip of the right wing, in the sense of maybe two of the holders of the major offices. And then you have maybe the remaining of the centrists, that would be Hunt, Javid, maybe Sunak. The problem is that a right winger is not electable without the Boris charisma. And the thing is that if you're going to vote for a centrist, why not just renew the whole thing and go for a Starmer? So the thing is that I think the dilemma that the party may find itself immersed into is very strong in that way.
Okay, that's really interesting. Let me, I can see Richard Bridge urging us on the chat to get back to the question of will Boris survive? So I think we should just begin to turn our attention to that. David, let me come to you on that and perhaps frame it by wondering whether the Conservative Party is a more complicated beast these days. So if I think about, past Tory splits, wets and dries, splits over Europe, is it more of a kaleidoscope these days? Are there, in the sense that you have the Europe as an issue that divides the Conservative Party, less now than perhaps it has in the past. You've got this axis that runs between sort of economy first and public health first. There are debates about the, Scotland and the Union and a sort of more English nationalist first school within the Conservative Party. Now, the Tory Party has always been a coalition, but does it seem to you that it's getting more difficult to govern, split in more complicated ways than it has been in the past?
Yes, it's getting more difficult, and that's partly because, if you like, the economic arguments that dominated the rise of Margaret Thatcher and the governments of hers and that followed her, are ones that have got a bit taken for granted and are now being challenged. There isn't that sense of solidarity and mutual reinforcement around a shared sort of economic project. And obviously the Europe divisions have become much more bitter. And the other thing that's happening in all political parties in all walks of life is that deference has gone. The idea that anybody told what to do by the party leader is likely just to salute nicely and say, yes, sir, that's gone for the birds. So it is difficult. And digital technology, the scrutiny that individual MPs come under now for each vote from their constituents makes a difference to how individual MPs position themselves, because they can't any longer get away with constituents not noticing. Very few constituents subscribe to Hansard, but a lot more may follow social media campaigns and local Facebook sites and so on to monitor what their local MP has been up to. So there are those problems, but I do think some of this, what we've been hearing, is exaggerated. I mean, there are only two ways, short of the Prime Minister deciding he wants to go, in which he could be forced out. One is if more than half of all Conservative MPs are prepared to vote him out in a no confidence debate, or at least tell the Chief Whip they will do that. And the other is, I suppose, if his cabinet lost confidence in him and a sufficient number of them of sufficient enough weight said, we are all resigning en bloc unless you choose to go. And I don't see either of those happening. I think you look at what has happened with previous prime ministers. John Major, after Black Wednesday in '92, and with a dwindling majority over the years, still managed to hang on. I'm very glad he did, but hung on despite pressure from factions within the party that he should quit. Gordon Brown had David Miliband briefing out every now and then he was going to resign. This was a final straw. James Pennell actually did resign from the cabinet to try to prompt a challenge to Gordon Brown's leadership. Didn't happen. Theresa May had a really tough time after we lost our majority in the 2017 election, but it still took until after the European elections and the collapse of the Conservative vote in the polls then before it was clear that she couldn't any longer sustain the support of the parliamentary party, or was likely to lose at least a very significant slice of cabinet support. So I think that Boris Johnson's instinct will be to press on, try by 1994, he'll put COVID behind him, have got Brexit behind him, and be focusing on, he will hope, levelling up, tackling some of the social and economic competitiveness challenges facing the country. I suspect that's how he will think about things. The one issue which we haven't mentioned so far, I think could throw things and introduce a really big element of uncertainty, is the union. And what happens if Nicola Sturgeon wins an overall majority next year? If we end up in a sort of Catalan-style campaign in Scotland for a second referendum and there's a real crisis over the future of the union, I think that would have a destabilizing impact. But I think there's a danger of exaggerating the degree of risk. What was exceptional was that big Conservative lead back in the spring of this year, at a time when all governments were getting a surge of support towards them as COVID broke. The Tory party's been in office for 10 years. It would frankly be astonishing at this stage if they were not starting to slip behind in the polls again. And you look back at Thatcher, look back at Major pre-1992, look back at Blair, they had periods when they went through troughs of unpopularity, and they still stayed the course, and they in those cases they did win elections afterwards. And I don't think we're yet at the stage where the Conservative Party has come near concluding that the next election is lost. I think that I think at the moment the instinct will be to not to challenge the PM.
Yeah. I'm going to bring Ivor Gabriel in a second, because Ivor's had his hand up for a while. So if we can make sure that Ivor's ready to go. But while we're doing that, Tim, I was interested to hear David mention how social media, local Facebook campaigns, those things affect the decision-making of MPs. So in America, you've seen the Republican Party decide, overwhelmingly that it's going to get behind Donald Trump, and it's calculated that, and you will see that play out in the November election. When you look around Conservative MPs in this country, do you think that different calculations are being made, that actually some of those MPs are really looking to their own local political atmosphere, establishing a local political profile, and actually putting distance between themselves and the Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, I think attitudes of Conservative MPs towards their leaders do depend in part on the size of their own majority. It's much easier to give someone a chance, as it were, to make things right if you're sitting on a 10,000 majority than it is if you've just won a Labour seat possibly by a narrow margin. There are, of course, considerations of ideology as well. It's not simply about majority. But I'm sure that MPs are making those calculations all the time. I mean, I think I agree with David that a challenge isn't imminent, but that doesn't mean that one won't come by, say, mid-term of this Parliament if things haven't turned around. I mean, the Conservative Party, to quote John Ramsden, who was a historian at Queen Mary, actually, he's an autocracy tempered by assassination. And it always has been fairly good at getting rid of leaders who it feels aren't up to the job. So it wouldn't surprise me, especially given the system that they have, which unlike Labour's doesn't actually require anyone to challenge Boris Johnson, that they might do that again. So I mean, I think it's a case of not yet, but watch this space.
And do you think, given what I put to David, and he sort of agreed with that the Conservative Party is a more complicated beast than perhaps it was, and that there are, we're not talking about a single division around a clear dividing line here. We're talking about pockets of concern about Boris Johnson for a whole host of different reasons. Does it potentially help Boris Johnson that the mood might be mutinous, but there isn't a single mutiny?
Well, I think clearly, there is an extent of divide and rule about these things every time they happen. But I think what he has to watch out for is that those factions, such as they are, don't come together and unite over a particular cause. And I think, what we're seeing, for example, on, the amendment next week is an example of that. Not everybody who's supporting the Brady Amendment, if that gets called, comes from the same faction of the Conservative Party, but they share slightly different concerns, but can all, as it were, come around and get together over that particular amendment. One other thing that we haven't mentioned, I think David's absolutely right to mention the union. That is going to be, I think, pretty crucial. But I don't think we've mentioned Brexit yet. and of course, that, as well as the economic situation, which we haven't necessarily factored in either, is going to be a very, very big factor, particularly if it doesn't go particularly well. I mean, I think the economy, in some senses, is more important, because if that goes very badly wrong, then I think basically all bets are off for Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party in any case.
Yeah. Okay. Ivor Gaber, are you out there?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and
right.
I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, I just wanted to shift it a bit, only because it's 45 minutes in, and I posted a rather facile comment saying it sounds to me a bit like Hamlet without the prince, because nobody has mentioned the Cummings factor. Now, I know there's a tendency, perhaps on the left, to over-exaggerate his influence, the bogeyman, but equally, I do think the strategy of this government is being dictated by Dominic Cummings, for good or not. And I'm wondering to what extent, if Johnson is seen to have failed or be failing or succeeding, to what extent will that be because he is doing basically what Dom is telling him to do?
Okay, so I know you've been around Westminster for a long time, Ivor. So do you would see Dominic Cummings as a category difference from people that you've seen working with the Prime Minister before?
Yeah, I mean, if I compare him to Alastair Campbell, Alastair was a very powerful figure, and not just on the communications but policy, but he didn't create a whole team around him which were driving in a particular direction. He didn't create a sense that there is a direction that this government is going in. And I say, I'll stay agnostic at this stage, but I do think the Cummings phenomena and all the people around him is something new. All right, little plug here. I've just published an article about their campaigning style, which I call strategic lying, because I do think that both in the Brexit campaign and in the 2019 campaign, the Tories or the Leave campaign developed under Cummings' tutelage, and you can read all about it in his blog, a whole new style of campaigning, which was basically based on misleading in a significant way. But what I'm trying to argue is that he's now taken this into government, and I do think he is driving, well, no, I don't think, I'm speculating, is he driving it, and is he driving it into failure?
Okay. Katie, are you still there? I can't see you on the screen, Katie Perrier. maybe we. Oh yeah, hello. Let's pick up on what Ivor said, but I'm just going to sort of bring someone else in, not actually Dominic Cummings, because I was interested in what Ivor said, but I'm equally interested in Rishi Sunak, and whether alongside the sort of the shrinking of the Prime Minister, we should think about the growth in Rishi Sunak. It's 227 days since he became Chancellor, and actually the trajectory has been pretty extraordinary, hasn't it?
It has. I mean, it's easier when you've got lots of cash to give away, and you're not working out how you're going to pay for it all yet, and that's horrible times to come. Look, Rishi is well respected amongst his colleagues. He's a very polite man who spends time with his colleagues. Don't forget, Dominic Cummings came into office, and I say Dominic Cummings came into office because I do view it in that way somewhat. He came into office telling basically behind the scenes that MPs don't matter. I don't care that they got elected. I don't care that they've done all their hard work. I couldn't give a damn about them. And ever since, I think they've all lived to regret that comment, because in the last few weeks, MPs have been going in and outside number 10. Number 10 are trying to get closer to them all the time. They're now thinking about potentially hiring someone who can get closer to MPs. A job for David Lidington there. I'm sure I'd be desperate to have it. And so I think they're regretting that. And so when you move forward and you think about Rishi, doesn't have any of that baggage, although I'm told Rishi and Dominic see eye to eye on a lot of things, and they're not at loggerheads. They really are. It's in terms of the economic policy as one. And so you don't necessarily, I would never necessarily say, well, if Boris got rid of Dominic, that would be the last of Dominic, because Dominic pops up in different places because lots of politicians have got time for him. And so he works with Michael Gove. I'm sure he'll work with Rishi in the future. So I think that is an issue. What I would say about one of the reasons Boris has a slight problem here is because he hates confrontation. And so he outsources it to someone else. He never ever likes having an argument, and he never likes telling people stuff they don't want to hear, which actually is a weakness in a politician. Sometimes you just got to stand up and tell people what they don't want to hear, and you've got to make the rational argument as to why you're right, and give us a fair hearing type of thing. And so, I mean, there were rumours and stories about when he was at City Hall, people were going to be fired, and they come out with promotion because they talked him into it. And I just think that there's a little bit of that. And so he outsources some of that stuff to Dominic. I think that Boris has to regain that ground now, and he has to show who's boss, and he has to leak or make it known that he has disagreed with Dominic on a range of different things and won the argument. And that there is a place for Dominic, who's a very, very smart person, who lots and lots of people appreciate and want to work with. But it's not Dominic that runs number 10, it is Boris Johnson. That's why I don't agree with a televised spokesperson. There's only one voice that comes out of number 10, and it should be the Prime Minister. And just finally on that point, really quickly, recently Boris turned up to the 1922 with a massive team. And I think he wanted to show that he was strong, and this is my team, and we're coming here. And loads of MPs said to me afterwards, it looked really weak. Like, I can't do it without my team. And I can't do this without this lot behind me. He needs to go it alone. He needs to go it alone and turn up and show that he's the boss. And if people disagree with him, much like the super forecaster that lasted 5 minutes at number 10, then they're out.
Okay. I wonder if we can just bring Ed Barker into the conversation, because I'm interested in something Ed is saying in the chat about the way that Boris Johnson has dealt with some of the ministers who've transgressed or messed up in various ways. Ed, are you there?
Hi. Yep. Hi.
So is your sense, Ed, that Boris Johnson has undermined his position through the way that he's handled some of these controversies around him?
Well, I suppose my question really, particularly looking to David, is obviously the Gavin Williamson saga became protracted, and the Dominic Cummings issue became even more protracted. Does that potentially lead to a sense of fearlessness amongst his inner circle, that they can take more chances, that they can not necessarily do what they like, but can they perhaps go a bit further? Can they put more bold policies out, or in even their own personal approaches? What does that send as a signal to the rest of the cabinet or the rest of the parliamentary party? Does it appear more brazen if Boris isn't willing to do anything about it? Katie, I suppose, really touched on it there when she said, is it an issue of not being able to sit down with someone who maybe you helped in his in his campaigns or who he'd worked with in the past, and being able to sit down and sack them for something that clearly is a sackable offence, which I personally think on the Cummings and the Targers were entirely merited.
Yeah. Okay, Ed, thank you. Ed, David, are you surprised, David, that the Boris Johnson cabinet remains intact?
No, because he's been in office for, well, he was since the general election. It's under a year, and you know, you don't, as no prime minister wants to be in the position where they're having to have reshuffles every few months, because it's not just the cabinet minister that moves. There's all the consequential moves that follow that. But I think, you know, a test will be, when he comes to make the next reshuffle, is whether that is seen to reward ministers who are good at doing their job or not. I think, you know, the press and Conservative MPs will you know, make a judgment on how he handles that reshuffle when that happens. I think with Dominic Cummings, look, my view was that the government could have managed, after Durham and Barnard Castle, something along the lines of saying, look, it was an emotional decision, heat of the moment, desperately worried about young family, realised it was all wrong. Prime Minister's, you know, given him the toughest of reprimands, but everybody needs to stay at their post during COVID. I think that would have died down within about 48 hours had that been the approach. I think it was the absence of any sense of contrition from anybody in government at a time when so many people were sacrificing family relationships because of the lockdown that really great. And there's no doubt, you know, look at the polls, that has had an effect on public confidence in willingness to follow government guidance from then on. But I think, like Katie, I think there's a place for clever, disruptive, maverick advisors, but it needs to be just that, as advisors. And what I'd like to see is visible demonstrations by the Prime Minister of trust in the ministers whom he has appointed to lead their departments and take policies through. And I think that I think MPs too would welcome a reassertion of the principle that it's ministers who are the Prime Minister's chief advisors in cabinet, and ministers are accountable to Parliament and the public at the end of the day, not advisors. And you know, the advisors need to be valued but kept in their place. And I think that resetting that balance would do the government a lot of good.
Yeah. Katie, let me just nip back to you and I'll come to Tim, because I'm going to ask a question that I think probably some people on the call, I'll look out for the cap, will think is sort of too much tittle-tattle, not sufficiently dignified. But you know, we've had a run of prime ministers whose personal lives have been relatively stable. So Theresa May, David Cameron, Gordon Brown. There was a solidity there that you know, we keep hearing. The reason I raise it is because we keep hearing from Downing Street or from people around there that that, to put it mildly, Boris Johnson's personal life is not as stable as those previous prime ministers, and that has an effect. That it's that you can chart his mood and his effectiveness based on how things are going in the flat upstairs. I mean, it's a given, I suppose, that that a relationship matters, particularly when times are extremely difficult. But do you believe that it is making a material difference to Boris Johnson as Prime Minister?
We don't know, do we? We're not inside that relationship. We're not inside that flat or those lifestyles. And I'm sure juggling his family in terms of his children and his new relationship. But I would much rather a Prime Minister who is in love and happy with their partner than someone that was sitting there on their own all day long with a bottle of gin, drinking it to the end every night. And so my view is it's none of my business. And you know what? The one thing that always strikes me, and you know, we spent most of this hour talking about Boris Johnson, but it's not just Boris Johnson that runs a government. Yes, he is the Prime Minister, yes, he's in charge, but you've got to let ministers run their departments, a little bit like what David said earlier. And I think that sometimes there is control freakery. It was when I was there at number 10, it's still going on now, whereby Ministers can't do what they want to do, and special advisors can't do what they want to do because there's too much control going on. And actually, there's a trust issue here. You just got to let them get on with it. And if they screw up, you fire them. And that's basically, you need to let them do a little bit more of their job. And so, yes, we can talk about Boris's private life. Yes, we can say whether or not that's a distraction. And I'm sure many people might think it is. But I'm more focused on the fact that, you can't run a government for long by fear without it turning on you, because it's like, keep on smacking a dog, at some point it's going to bite you. That was a comment that someone threw around this week. I can't remember who it wasn't me, but I agree with that. You cannot keep on being threatening to your team or run it in such a controlled manner. You've got to be collegiate. You've got to have each other's back. You've got to say, you know what, when you go into that and make that really tough decision, I will back you. And there's not enough of that going on at government at the moment. It's not a natural place to be. If you think about the job as Mayor of London, it's quite a lonely job. It's quite, you're on your own most of the day. It's you're the big star set piece. And here is a cabinet. And I think that a lot of the success moving forward over 2021 will be if he comes together, gets the cabinet that he wants, and then lets them act like a cabinet.
Yeah. So from that perspective, Katie, the Graham Brady amendment, which will try to allow Parliament to take account of legislation and amend legislation that, rather than simply operating through sort of executive fiat. And what we hear from Dominic Cummings, that he's urging ministers to spend more time in the tea rooms. Those would seem to you, Katie, like sensible accommodations to make greater account of Parliament and backbench MPs and everything that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And so, the reshuffle that comes up at some point, I think it's in January, we're thinking about potentially January or somewhere soon, that needs to show that he is in control. And these people are, they've got his back, he's going to work with them in the future. And so now's the time, if you are a minister. So this is why I don't buy the argument that there's such a revolt. With a reshuffle around the corner, people are going to, maybe say these things quietly, or maybe have a quiet word with Graham Brady, but they're not going to break cover because there's a possibility of working with Boris Johnson in the future. And why would they ruin it now? And so I think that they are grumbly. They're unhappy that the comms has been so poor during the crisis. They don't want to make the same mistakes. If you're going into a second wave, at least look like you've learned from the first time round. Don't just keep on making the same mistakes again. And so they want a bit of that. They want confidence that we're learning all the time. We haven't got this right, and we're learning all the time. And many of the comments I've seen in the chat boxes tonight is about empathy. It goes back into follows what David said earlier. Have empathy with people who are going through a tough time right now. What about the thousands of people that are self-employed that don't get any help from this government and their businesses have fallen flat? They were the ones that were employing people 6 months ago. They were the wealth generators of the country. And, they've somehow fell through the loop. They are natural Conservative voters. Boris Johnson will not rely on their vote next time round. And so it's things like that. How do we make it good how do we make it right for these people? How can we help moving forward? But, there's some really desperately tough times ahead, and you can't do it unless you've got a grip on the strategic direction which you're going in. Okay.
Tim, let me come back to you for the sort of final word, because astonishingly we are over time already. So I think if we go back to our first question, can Boris survive? David Liddington answered that a while ago with a yes, he can. We've just heard from Katie, I think, saying that yes, he can. What's your view on that basic question?
I suspect that all hinges, to be honest, on the economy and also on how well the public continue to think of Keir Starmer. I think if the economy heads south very, very badly, I think if Brexit turns out not to deliver on some of the promises that it seemed to many of its supporters, and I think if Keir Starmer continues to reposition Labour in the centre and continues to be seen as a serious prospect as an alternative Prime Minister, then I think Tory MPs will begin to wonder whether they've picked the right guy and whether there might be someone else around who might be able to do a better job of rescuing them if they need rescuing.
Great. Okay. As I said, we have come to the end of our allotted time. At this point, it falls to me to try to sort of pull together the various things that have been said and see whether we could make sense of them at Tortoise. So I guess, look, the simple point is, can Boris survive? The answer is clearly yes, he can. I acknowledge at the start it's very, very early to start asking that question. I think a lot of Conservative MPs will be thinking the same. But let's come back to that question of what the pandemic has revealed and what it's changed, because it seems to me that the Prime Minister's illness has been a huge factor in taking us to this current position. So we know that he came into this crisis with a reputation for a lack of grip and poor attention to detail in circumstances, and we don't know how much long COVID or his current state of health have exacerbated those, but it certainly won't have made things any easier in circumstances which, as David and Katie and everybody else has pointed out, were already extremely trying, almost unimaginably difficult. I think, as David said, it does seem to me that the Conservative Party is a more difficult proposition to handle these days. I'm interested in whether this sort of new dividing line that's appeared between the economy first element of the party and the sort of public health first is creating new sets of divisions that cut across old divisions, because as you see from the Brady Amendment, that has captured the attention of a whole variety of people from very different wings of the party as we traditionally have viewed those. So I think you can argue that the Conservative Party has become a trickier proposition for a Prime Minister, and as all our speakers have said, looking ahead, the next few months look really rough. So unemployment shooting up, the NHS under massive strain, Brexit to negotiate, or the end of the transition agreement to get through. But other side of Christmas, if we achieve some sort of skinny deal, there are not queues in Kent, if a vaccine is possibly in sight, then you could begin to see how things could brighten radically. I suppose in the end, what I take from this evening's conversation is that the appeal of Boris Johnson was that he's a winner. It's a sort of three-legged appeal. He's a winner, he's an optimist, as Katie was telling us, he's a libertarian, and that's been a very difficult trick to pull off. It's difficult to look like a winner in a pandemic. It's hard to pull off the optimistic shtick, and when Boris Johnson has tried it, it hasn't really worked. And the Prime Minister's libertarian instincts have been, those wings have been clipped by his own experience and by the advice he's getting from Chris Whitty and from Matt Hancock and others. So I guess it looks as if a real comeback for Boris Johnson might depend on the appearance of a vaccine. And that, I think, is quite a slender thread to hang a career from. So that's a whole bunch of things that I take from this. Let me thank Tim, let me thank Katie, let me thank David Liddington, everybody else who's chipped in, and we look forward to seeing you. If you're up and about early tomorrow morning, we have a breakfast thinking, I believe, is that right? I can't see. I think we have an 8 o'clock breakfast. Yeah, we have a thinking tomorrow morning. So we hope you might see you there bright and early at 8 o'clock, but otherwise we'll see you very soon.